There is a sentence that many women say before they say what they actually mean. And you have more than likely heard some version of it before. And if you're anything like me, you may have even said some version of this yourself. And it sounds like, I don't usually do this, but, or I wasn't going to say anything, or I really hate bringing this up, but sometimes it sounds like, I don't want any drama. I just think, These statements may seem harmless, but they are actually doing more work than we often realize. They function as a buffer, an apology, and a kind of advanced defense. Often as women, before we express disappointment, name a boundary, correct a misunderstanding, or claim credit for our own work, we frequently feel compelled to reassure everyone that we are not trying to be difficult. It is a setup before the expression. It is the small offering we place at the feet of the room before we tell the truth. We want everyone to know that we are not trying to create conflict. Nope. We're not trying to make anyone uncomfortable or occupy more space than we believe that we've been given. We simply just need to say one small thing, and we hope that by softening the opening, those on the receiving end won't shift their perspective of us, hoping that we can walk away unscathed. Once you begin noticing these disclaimers, you will hear them everywhere. Before a woman says that a boundary was crossed, she often finds herself explaining that she is usually very understanding. Before she corrects an idea that has actually been attributed to someone else, she clarifies that she is not trying to take anything away from anybody else, right? Before she disagrees, she often makes sure that everyone else around her knows that she respects all perspectives. Before she says, okay, you know what? That was my work, okay? She performs a small ritual of reluctance so that no one actually mistakes her certainty for arrogance. I began thinking about this pattern more seriously while following the conversation surrounding professional makeup artist Ngozi Esther Edeme, who is also known as Painted by Esther, and Patrick Ta, with his new product launch and trademarking of the phrase transition blush, right? So there is really so much that I could say about this, okay? So much that I want to say about contribution, influence, power, culture, okay? Like who becomes the face of an idea. However, one detail stayed with me long after everything else had quieted down, and it was this. Esther did not want to speak about the controversy, okay? More specifically, her reluctance was not rooted in lack of knowledge. It wasn't because she lacked a level of artistry or that she didn't have a point of view, okay? That she didn't have a right to even address anything, right? It was really that she did not want to be seen as an aggressive Black woman, okay? And she is literally watching people have this debate all around her. She knows that she's contributed, yet she hesitated. And that hesitation deserves to become more than a footnote in a beauty conversation, if it's even acknowledged at all. Esther was not merely deciding whether she had something to say. She was actually calculating what saying it would cost her. The deeper question was not simply, okay, should I speak? The deeper question was, what will speaking make me become in the eyes of people who were never going to extend me the benefit of the doubt in the first place? She had to consider whether she would be perceived as angry, bitter, jealous, dramatic, or even opportunistic. She had to consider whether defending her own contribution would somehow be used as evidence that she did not deserve recognition at all. She had to anticipate the possibility that people would focus more on the manner in which she defended herself than on the substance of what she was actually saying. And that is an enormous amount of weight to carry before a sentence has ever even left your mouth, okay? And it is a weight that many women understand intimately. The first battle is, what actually happened. It may be the boundary that was crossed, the credit that disappeared, the idea that was repeated by someone else and all of a sudden is treated as magnanimous and brilliant, right? Or the moment when your silence was interpreted as consent. That first battle is difficult enough. The second battle begins almost immediately. And it is the internal negotiation over whether you are actually allowed to say anything about it in the first place. The second battle is the time that you spend rewriting an email because the original version sounded too direct. It is you sending a text to several of your friends asking whether your response sounds like it's rude. It is rehearsing a conversation in your head over and over again so thoroughly that by the time you actually have it, okay, you're actually more concerned with making the other person comfortable than with expressing what you actually need to say. Okay, it is the exhausting experience of defending your right to defend yourself, right? Now, men, broadly speaking, do not appear to have to approach assertion with the same ritual. A man can say, that was my idea. I disagree, or simply, that doesn't work for me. He may choose to explain his position, but he is not always expected to establish his innocence before he actually expresses it. He can speak plainly without disarming anyone. He doesn't have to disarm the recipient or collapse into agreeableness. Women often, though, feel agreeableness pressure. For Black women in particular, calculation carries an additional layer because certain labels are already waiting for us. As a Black woman, we can speak directly or firmly, and we can end up being described as aggressive, intimidating, angry, difficult, or unprofessional. And these are not inconsequential. They can really affect our relationships, opportunities, reputation, our safety, and even our income. And the fear of being perceived is therefore not imaginary, okay? It is often rooted in our lived experience. And as women in general, we learn to ease up because softness was sometimes reduced. They reduce consequences of speaking, right? And so we smile before correcting someone. We add exclamation marks or emojis to sentences that aren't even exciting. We use the word just to make reasonable requests appear smaller than they are. We say, I just wanted to follow up, even when following up is a part of our job, okay? It's a part of our responsibility. We say, I just thought I should mention this, even when the information is important. We say, okay, I'm not trying to start anything before addressing something that should have never even happened in the first place. For a long time, I actually thought that these disclaimers were simply a form of false humility. I believed women who were I thought that women were unnecessarily weakening their arguments, and I thought that the solution was straightforward. Simply, we needed to stop apologizing, right? And we actually needed to say what we mean. However, the more I have studied good girl conditioning and silencing the self theory, the more incomplete that answer really has begun to feel. The disclaimer is not merely bad communicate. It's not merely a bad communication habit. In many cases, it's actually a survival strategy. It was built over years and sometimes even over generations in response to a real social cost. Women who spoke bluntly have often been punished for it. Women who refuse to soften, right, have been socially penalized. Women who named what happened have been accused of becoming the problem. The nervous system learns from experience. It learns that being liked can determine belonging, that being agreeable can reduce conflict, and that managing everyone else's perception may be the safest way to maintain access to the group. Eventually, the disclaimer becomes automatic, simply because the body has learned to associate directness with danger. Now, scripture tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. I do not believe that means that every feeling of fear is evidence of spiritual failure. Sometimes fear is the body actually remembering what directness cost us at one point. However, fear does not have to become the final authority over what we say. Power allows us to remain present within ourselves. Love allows us to consider the person receiving the truth. A sound mind allows us to discern what needs to be said, when it needs to be said, and how to say it without abandoning what is true. This is why I have come to think of the disclaimer as a tax on assertion. And when I say that, I'm not suggesting that, the women paying the tax have done something inherently wrong. I am saying that the culture surrounding us has charged us an additional price for the right to speak, right? We have to spend emotional energy making truth palatable. We have to prove that we're reasonable before anyone considers whether we're right. We have to perform warmth before we are allowed to express disappointment. We have to make our defense sound gentle so that the other person who actually caused the harm never has to feel accused of it. That additional labor is the tax. Some women have become so accustomed to paying it that we no longer actually recognize the cost. We simply know that our hearts begin beating faster when we prepare to say something difficult. We know that we feel compelled to over-explain. We know that a simple sentence can feel dangerous in our mouths. Sentences such as, "No, I disagree. That was my contribution. That is not what happened. And I deserve to be acknowledged for this." These should not require us to prove our goodness before we can actually say them. There is something deeply biblical about learning to speak plainly. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 37 in the Amplified, Jesus says, "But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Affirm yes or no." He is not instructing us to build an elaborate case around every boundary or bury, our truthful answers beneath layers of qualification. There is a kind of integrity in saying what we mean without manipulating, disguising, or apologizing for the truth of it. For many women, however, even that level of plainness can feel dangerous. We have been taught explicitly or implicitly that direct language threatens the version of us the world is most willing to accept. This matters deeply in conversation about legitimacy and power. Because if a woman's contribution is real, regardless of whether it has been publicly recognized, then her right to name and defend that contribution must also be real. Esther's claim to her work did not become less legitimate because she hesitated to speak about it. Her hesitation did not actually weaken the truth of her contribution. It actually reveals the cost that she had to calculate before exercising a right that should never have required calculation at all. The disclaimer does not undo the truth beneath it. Instead, it provides the evidence of everything a woman has had to move through in order to say the truth aloud. Perhaps you recognize this pattern within yourself. You may have a conversation that you've been rehearsing for days. You may know exactly what you need to say, okay? But you keep searching for a version of the sentence that will guarantee no one will misunderstand you. You may be telling yourself that you need to calm down. Maybe you need to gather more proof, wait for a better moment, or become completely unbothered before you are actually entitled to speak. And here is what I want you to know. You do not need to come emotionless in order to become credible. You do not need to be perfectly composed for what happened to be true. You do not need to eliminate every possibility of being perceived incorrectly before you are allowed to express yourself. What I want women and what I want for myself to practice even more, okay, is not the complete elimination of the instinct to soften. That would actually be unrealistic. Some of us have paid too high a price for directness to pretend the instinct will just disappear because we listen to a good podcast episode, right? What I want is for us to become aware of the instinct. I want us to hear the sentence while it's actually forming in our minds and recognize it for what it is. It is not evidence that we are unworthy to speak. It is often the residue of every experience that taught us that we needed permission before we could tell the truth. Once we notice it, we can ask ourselves a more useful question. What is the truth underneath the disclaimer? Perhaps the truth is, I did not appreciate that. Perhaps it is, that idea originated from me. It may be, I need you to stop. Now, you can still choose your timing correctly, and Ecclesiastes remind us that there is a time to keep silent and a time to speak. Wisdom is not proven by speaking at every opportunity, but neither is staying silent, okay? Silence is not always evidence that you are shrinking. You may decide that restraint is actually appropriate. You may determine that a particular room has not earned access to your vulnerability, because speaking with your whole chest does not mean saying whatever to everyone, right? The question is whether your silence is a conscious decision or a surrender to fear. There is a difference between choosing not to speak and believing that you are not allowed to speak. And as women of faith, we are often told to speak the truth in love, but I think we often frequently are taught to misinterpret that instruction as though love requires us to make the truth nearly unrecognizable. Ephesians chapter 4 does not ask us to choose between honesty and care. It holds them together. Love can actually shape the posture from which we speak without requiring us to dilute the substance of the very thing that must be said. Speaking with your whole chest does not mean speaking recklessly, cruelly, or without regard for another person. It means that when you decide to speak, you no longer abandon yourself in the process. You do not insult yourself before the room has the opportunity to do it. You do not diminish the truth in order to make it easier for other people to receive. You do not place a ritual disclaimer in front of your own authority. You can notice the fear. You can understand where it came from. You can even offer compassion to the part of you that learned to soften in order to remain safe. But then, when the moment requires it, you can still say your truth. This episode was brought to you by On the Line, a magazine and conversation for women who want more and are willing to become more. Until next time, say it with your full chest.